The sun had barely risen over the rugged French coastline on September 7, 1944, when the Allied forces advancing across Brittany finally caught sight of the massive granite-black shape looming above the Penfeld River, the fortress city of Brest. What stood before them was not merely a port, not simply another objective to be crossed off Eisenhower's long list of strategic targets, but an ancient, sprawling stronghold carved out of stone and shaped by centuries of warfare. Bastions, blockhouses, ramparts, moats, tunnels, cliffs, Brest had been built to resist invaders long before the Germans arrived. Now, in the dying months of World War II, it had become something even more formidable, a last-stand citadel filled with hardened, cornered Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine troops, transformed into a fortress of desperation where every street, every building, every meter of rubble would be defended with the suicidal ferocity of men ordered, explicitly, to fight to the last breath. For the Americans of the 8th Corps pouring in from the east, the approach to Brest was a dawning realization that they were not facing a retreating enemy, but a cornered animal, wounded but rabid, ready to tear apart anything that moved. As the morning haze drifted away and the first artillery spotting rounds arced overhead, the city seemed eerily still, quiet in the way only a battlefield preparing to erupt can be, until the unmistakable bark of German anti-aircraft guns shattered the calm and signaled that the siege had begun. Across the shattered fields beyond the city limits, American infantry divisions fanned out to probe the outer defenses. Patrols moved cautiously through hedgerows and cratered farmland, feeling the invisible eyes of snipers tracking them from hidden bunkers. Engineers worked under fire to clear minefields deliberately laid in thick patterns to funnel attackers toward pre-sighted kill zones. Every few minutes, a muffled explosion rippled through the ground as a soldier stepped too close to a buried charge, or a cluster of barbed wire concealed a booby trap. And overhead, German spotters hidden in fortified towers called in artillery fire with chilling precision. Shells screamed across the sky, slamming into the advancing American lines, throwing dirt, limbs, and equipment into the air. This was not a delaying action. This was not a tactical withdrawal. This was Brest, a fortress commanded by General Hermann Bernhard Ramcke, a paratrooper veteran with orders straight from Hitler himself. Hold. Do not surrender. Fight to the last man. Every American who stepped within firing distance of the outer ring of fortifications could feel it. This was not going to be a quick operation. This was going to be a siege, brutal, grinding, relentless. To the soldiers of the U.S. 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry Divisions, the fortress seemed almost alive, as though its heavy stone structure breathed, pulsed, and shifted with the movement of defenders inside its labyrinthian corridors. Every opening in the walls, every embrasure, every trench slit, every collapsed doorway could hide a machine gun or a sniper, and they often did. The first probing attacks revealed a network of hidden bunkers so deeply dug into the granite cliffs that direct hits from American artillery barely chipped the outer facades. German machine gun fire poured from invisible angles. Mortars whistled down from the tops of ancient bastions. Even communication trenches built in the age of Napoleon had been reinforced with concrete, turning them into sheltered highways through which German defenders moved unseen, reappearing suddenly to strike at American flanks. It felt to the attackers as though Brest was less a city and more a living fortress, one that responded, adapted, and lashed out with every advancing step. And inside, the German defenders, a mix of Wehrmacht infantry, Kriegsmarine sailors, paratroopers, fortress troops, and even Hitler Youth volunteers, hunkered down in their underground strongholds, grimly aware that they were surrounded, cut off from the rest of France, and left with only one directive: no surrender. Many of them had no illusions about survival. Rumors had spread that no relief force was coming. Communications with other German units were sporadic at best. Supplies were dwindling. Ammunition would run out long before reinforcements ever appeared. Yet morale remained viciously determined. Ramcke and his officers had turned the ancient fortress into a death trap. Mines carpeted every open space. Streets were blocked with rubble. Buildings were rigged with explosives. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Every alley, every cellar, every rooftop had been transformed into a defensible kill-or-die position. The Germans were not defending Brest to hold territory. They were defending it to bleed the Americans dry. By the afternoon of the first day, artillery duels raged across the landscape. American howitzers thundered non-stop, slamming into the fortress walls with earth-shaking force, but Brest swallowed the shells like a beast absorbing blows, its old stone refusing to crumble easily. German counter-battery fire erupted almost instantly, raining steel onto American staging grounds. Forward observers on both sides dashed between cover points, sending coordinates through crackling radios. Columns of thick smoke rose into the sky, marking the first hours of what would become a 3-week hell. As the dusk settled over the battlefield, the Americans dug in for nightfall, knowing that darkness offered no safety. Brest at night was a different creature entirely. The Germans used the cover of night to reposition machine gun crews, move ammunition, and repair damaged fortifications. Shadowy figures slipped through underground passages, emerging in unexpected places to launch sudden attacks. Sniper fire echoed in the darkness, mines detonated, flares burst overhead, casting the ruined landscape in ghostly white light. And the Americans, exhausted from a day of probing attacks and counterattacks, huddled in shallow foxholes, listening to the fortress breathe beneath the moonlight. But the true scope of the siege was still unseen. The Americans had only skimmed the surface of Brest's defenses. The ancient stronghold hid layers upon layers of fortifications, massive underground casemates, bunkers carved into bedrock, tunnels stretching beneath the city, hidden artillery positions buried so deep they were nearly impervious to bombardment. The Germans held all the advantages: high ground, prepared defenses, interconnected firing points, and a fanatical order from the highest authority. And as night fell, and the fortress remained defiantly intact, the American commanders realized the grim truth. Brest would not fall quickly. Not in a day, not in a week. This would be a siege measured by blood. American infantry units rotated through the lines, each discovering firsthand the nightmare of fighting a fortified medieval city modernized by German engineering. Patrols sent forward under cover of night often vanished in flashes of gunfire. Engineers tasked with clearing minefields returned battered and shaken. Artillery observers reported that even direct hits from heavy shells failed to collapse the bunkers guarding the main approaches. Still, the Americans pressed forward. The port of Brest was needed, desperately. The Allied armies advancing through France required a deep-water harbor for supplies, and though Cherbourg and other ports had fallen, Brest remained the crown jewel of German Atlantic naval bases. On the German side, desperation mixed with deadly resolve. Paratroopers, Ramcke's elite Fallschirmjäger, moved with cold efficiency, reinforcing sectors under attack, launching counterattacks at dawn, retaking lost ground with grim professionalism. Kriegsmarine sailors manned anti-aircraft guns repurposed for ground defense, firing at infantry columns with the same precision they had once used against Allied bombers. Even teenagers of the Hitler Youth fought with frightening zeal, hurling grenades from rooftops and darting through alleyways with reckless courage. The first 24 hours of the siege ended with no territorial gains for either side, but dozens dead, hundreds wounded, and a grim recognition settling over the battlefield. Brest was not a city. It was a fortress, and it would have to be taken inch by inch, bunker by bunker, stone by stone. The Americans prepared for the brutal days ahead. The Germans tightened their defenses and vowed to fight, as ordered, to the last man. The Siege of Brest, one of the most savage urban battles of the Western Front, had only just begun.
Dawn broke on the second day of the Siege of Brest under a dull gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down heavily on the earth, turning smoke into a suffocating blanket that clung to the ruins of the outer city. As the first light crept across the shattered terrain, the Americans began their initial serious assaults on the German defensive ring, and almost immediately discovered that everything they had seen the day before had barely scratched the surface of what the fortress truly hid. The moment the infantry divisions pushed forward in earnest, the fortress revealed its teeth. German machine gun nests that had fallen silent during the night roared awake with the fury of trapped animals, stitching the morning air with deadly arcs of fire. Mortars thumped rhythmically from behind thick concrete walls. Hidden anti-tank guns, concealed so well that even aerial reconnaissance had failed to identify them, opened fire on American armored columns attempting to push closer to the city. The first Sherman tank to roll up one of the narrow approach roads was hit squarely by a perfectly placed 75mm shell, erupting into a fireball that sent its turret flying like a kicked metal can. Infantrymen dove for cover as burning debris rained down. It took only seconds for them to realize that the Germans had pre-sighted every approach, every crossing, every likely avenue of attack. This was not simply a defended city. This was a mathematically calculated kill zone designed to bleed attackers dry. The Americans responded with overwhelming firepower. Artillery battalions that had spent the night repositioning unleashed a devastating barrage on suspected German positions. The ground shook as 105mm and 155mm shells slammed into the granite fortifications. Explosions blossomed across the horizon, sending black clouds rising into the sky like volcanic plumes. Infantrymen huddled behind whatever cover they could find, ditches, craters, shattered walls, watching the spectacle of destruction. But as soon as the bombardment lifted and the assault companies advanced, the fortress seemed to shrug off the damage. Machine guns resumed firing from apertures that had been hidden moments earlier. Snipers reappeared in cracked windows. Mortar shells bracketed the American lines with terrifying accuracy. The Germans had survived the storm. Their fortifications, carved into bedrock, reinforced with steel, and connected by an intricate labyrinth of tunnels, were designed precisely for this situation. Bombardment alone would never dislodge them. American infantry advancing through the outskirts of Brest soon learned another brutal truth. The city itself was part of the fortress. Every street was wired with explosives. Every intersection had been turned into a kill funnel. Buildings had been gutted, reinforced, or converted into miniature fortresses. German sharpshooters positioned in upper floors, behind steel plates with tiny firing slits, picked off officers and radio operators with chilling precision. Clearing each structure required teams of engineers to move forward with explosives, flamethrowers, and grenades, working room by room while under constant threat of booby traps or close-quarter ambushes. Even when a building was taken, snipers might still be hiding in attic spaces or underground cellars connected by tunnels to adjacent structures. The Americans found themselves fighting a three-dimensional battle, above ground, at ground level, and deep below. One of the first major objectives was a seemingly ordinary hill, Fort Montbarey, a monstrous concrete and granite stronghold whose roots reached back to the 18th century but had been modernized by the Germans into a nightmare of overlapping fields of fire and steel-lined corridors. The Americans approached Montbarey cautiously, sending reconnaissance patrols forward under cover of smoke. They reached the first trench line without taking fire, raising hopes that the Germans had withdrawn to stronger positions. But as soon as an engineer team stepped onto the open ground leading to the fort, an 88mm gun hidden behind a camouflaged wall spat fire, obliterating them in a single blast. Machine guns opened up from at least 6 different angles. An entire infantry platoon was pinned down instantly, unable to move without attracting deadly fire. Attempts to flank the position were met with equally fierce resistance, as German paratroopers, skilled in close-quarter tactics, launched counterattacks through subterranean tunnels, appearing behind American lines like ghosts emerging from the earth. American commanders quickly realized that Brest was not just a fortress, it was a network of fortresses, each capable of functioning independently, each designed to inflict maximum casualties. Fort Montbarey alone could tie down an entire regiment for days, and it did. As the fighting intensified, American engineers uncovered the true extent of the tunnel system beneath the city. These tunnels, some dating back centuries, had been expanded and reinforced by the Germans to create a subterranean highway. They allowed defenders to disappear from one sector and reappear in another without ever exposing themselves to enemy fire. A bunker overrun by American infantry might appear silent and secured, only to erupt moments later when German troops tunneled in from behind and launched a counterattack. The psychological toll on the attackers was immense. Soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to multiply, reappear, and strike from impossible angles. Even when the Americans blasted tunnel entrances shut, new ones were discovered a few meters away. Meanwhile, German artillery continued to pound the American lines with frightening accuracy. Spotters hidden deep within the fortress used pre-war range tables and centuries-old schematics of the fortifications to guide their fire. The Americans tried to silence these guns with aerial bombardment, but low clouds, thick smoke, and sheltered gun positions limited the effectiveness of the strikes. Every time the aircraft lifted, the German cannons resumed firing. The cost began to mount. In the first major push toward the inner ring of fortifications, an entire company of the 29th Infantry Division was pinned in a courtyard for hours, unable to move under crossfire from 3 hidden machine guns. A platoon of engineers attempting to clear a minefield was wiped out by a sudden mortar barrage. Medical teams struggled to reach the wounded. Stretcher bearers crawled through mud and debris as bullets whistled overhead. The wounded who couldn't be moved took shelter in shell craters, whispering prayers while artillery thundered around them. Despite the carnage, the Americans made incremental gains. They captured outer blockhouses. They seized several abandoned trenches. They pushed closer to the main defensive line. But every gain came at a terrible cost, and every step forward felt like walking deeper into a deliberate killing ground. And still, the Germans fought on. Disciplined, determined, and clearly prepared to die where they stood. Inside the fortress, the situation for the Germans was growing increasingly desperate. Ammunition supplies were low, food was scarce, water shortages forced many to ration what little they had. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, yet none of this seemed to diminish their will to resist. General Ramcke moved from bunker to bunker, rallying his men, promising that relief would come, insisting that honorable men fought to the end. And the defenders believed him, or at least acted as though they did. From teenagers to hardened veterans, they maintained their positions with a grim, fatalistic resolve that stunned American soldiers, unused to seeing such unwavering resistance in the West. As the second full day of the siege drew to a close, the Americans withdrew slightly to regroup, dragging their wounded back to makeshift field hospitals established in the ruins behind the lines. Fires burned across the landscape. The sky glowed red. Craters littered every road and open field. The smell of smoke, blood, and cordite clung to everything. Commanders met to plan the next phase of the battle. They knew now that frontal assaults alone would not break Brest. They needed to isolate each fortress, cut tunnel access, breach outer walls with explosives, and push forward with infantry supported by tanks and artillery in a slow, methodical advance. The siege was no longer about speed. It was about attrition. And Brest was more than ready for the challenge. As night once again fell over the fortress city, the defenders watched from their hidden positions, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their hands gripping rifles worn by sweat and smoke. They knew the Americans would return in the morning. They knew the battle had only begun. And they knew, with fatalistic pride, that they were ready to fight again.
The third day of the Siege of Brest dawned with the distant rumble of artillery already shaking the air, a grim, familiar morning soundtrack that signaled the Americans' readiness to make their first determined push against the outer fortifications. By now they understood the nature of the enemy and the terrain. Brest was not a city to be captured with bold maneuvers or sudden breakthroughs. It was a fortress that demanded a slow, deliberate, and methodical dissection. The objective for the day was clear: storm and seize the first ring of major outlying forts that shielded the inner city. These concrete monsters, designated by their old French names and reinforced by German engineering, were the backbone of Brest's defenses. Among them, Fort Caranro, Fort Penfeld, and the heavy casement positions overlooking the main road posed the greatest challenge. As the Americans massed for the assault, the air thickened with tension.
Engineers prepared demolition charges. Tanks rumbled into position, their guns angled towards slit-like embrasures. Infantry squads checked ammunition, grenades, flamethrowers, and Bangalore torpedoes. Everyone knew that taking these positions would come at a brutal price. Everyone also knew that failing to take them meant the siege would drag on indefinitely. When the preparatory bombardment began, it was as if the entire horizon erupted at once. Hundreds of American guns, 105mm howitzers, 155mm long toms, and even naval guns brought in from offshore opened fire in a coordinated bone-rattling barrage. The shells screamed overhead in an unending stream, slamming into the outer forts with earth-shattering force. The ground vibrated with each explosion. Dust clouds rose like volcanic eruptions. Stonework cracked, trees splintered. For half an hour, the bombardment continued without pause, shaking even the rear positions where American infantry waited in the trenches. Some soldiers watching the bombardment wondered if anything inside the forts could survive such devastation. The Germans survived. Because the moment the barrage lifted and the Americans surged forward, the fortress revealed the truth. Its outer walls were scarred, blackened, and cratered, but still intact, and the defenders were very much alive. Machine guns opened first, the sharp, vicious chatter of MG-42s slicing through the air like ripping canvas. Mortars followed, arcing overhead to detonate among the advancing troops. The first wave of infantry hit the ground, pinned down before they had crossed more than 20 meters. Tanks attempted to push forward, to suppress the bunkers, but hidden anti-tank guns, warm from the bombardment but still functional, fired in perfectly timed shots. One Sherman tank burst into flames as an armor-piercing round tore through its hull. Another lost a track to a mine deliberately placed in the narrow approach path. Engineers rushed forward with smoke grenades, creating a great curtain that billowed across the battlefield, giving the infantry a chance to move. Under cover of smoke, American assault squads sprinted toward the first bunkers. Flamethrower teams ignited their nozzles, sending jets of burning fuel into firing slits. Riflemen tossed grenades into embrasures. Machine gunners went prone and poured suppressive fire into any opening they could find. The air filled with the hiss of flames, the explosion of grenades, and the screams of defenders inside the burning bunkers. Yet even as these outposts were neutralized, more fire erupted from secondary positions the Americans hadn't seen. Brest's outer forts were not simple strongpoints. They were multi-layered, interconnected, brutal puzzles designed to trick attackers into thinking they had silenced a position, only to discover that the real threat was 50 meters behind it. At Fort Caranro, the Americans encountered the full horror of German field engineering. The outer trench system was protected by double rows of barbed wire, covered by overlapping machine gun nests hidden in reinforced blockhouses. Attempts to cut the wire under fire were suicidal. The solution was brutal but effective: Bangalore torpedoes. Engineers crawled forward on their stomachs with the long tube-shaped explosives, pushing them under wire entanglements while bullets cracked around them. Several were killed in the attempt. The survivors detonated the torpedoes, ripping gaps wide enough for infantry to charge through. When the Americans finally reached the main entrance of Caranro, they discovered that the German defenders had sealed the doors from the inside. The only way in was through the gun embrasures or ventilation shafts. Engineers placed demolition charges against the steel door frames, while infantry held off German counterfire. The explosion shook the entire fort, buckling the door just enough for the first squad to slip inside. What followed was one of the most claustrophobic and savage fights of the entire siege. The interior of Fort Caranro was a maze of narrow corridors, low ceilings, and interconnected firing chambers. Germans waited in every bend and corner, firing point-blank into the assaulting troops. Grenades bounced off walls and detonated in tight spaces, sending shrapnel ricocheting like angry hornets. Flamethrower teams cleared room after room, filling the fort with thick, choking smoke. Riflemen barked. German submachine guns answered. The screams of wounded men echoed through concrete hallways. In several chambers, hand-to-hand combat erupted as both sides grappled in the confined space, fighting with bayonets, rifle butts, and knives. It took hours, bloody, exhausting hours, but the Americans finally secured Caranro. And when they emerged into daylight, covered in dust, soot, and the smell of burned fuel, they expected the collapse of the German defense line. But Brest was not finished.
Because the moment Coranro fell, Fort Penfeld opened fire with renewed intensity, unleashing mortar after mortar on the American positions. German paratroopers mounted a counterattack through the tunnel system linking the forts. They emerged unexpectedly behind the newly exhausted American squads, firing into their flanks and forcing them to retreat from ground they had fought all morning to secure. One squad leader described the moment as like fighting ghosts who could walk through walls. American reinforcements rushed in, plugging the gaps and repelling the counterattack. Flamethrowers roared again. Machine gun crews repositioned. Tanks, those still intact, attempted to maneuver around the captured fort to provide covering fire against Penfeld. But the Germans in Penfeld were fresh, well-supplied, and in higher ground. Their mortar fire was devastating. Still, momentum favored the Americans. Throughout the afternoon, they assaulted Penfeld from multiple angles. Engineers blasted open exterior doors. Tanks fired point-blank into firing slits. Infantry squads surged into trenches, firing on the move. German defenders fought fiercely, paratroopers launching counterattacks with grenades and knives, but the Americans pressed on relentlessly. By sunset, Penfeld was in American hands. The breakthrough was real. The outer ring of forts, the defensive spine of the German perimeter, had finally begun to crumble. And yet, the triumph was hollow. Because once the Americans reached the top of the captured fortifications and looked toward the interior of Brest, they saw the true scale of what awaited them. More fortresses, more bunkers, more concrete, more tunnels, more defenders. What they had taken was only the outer ring. What remained was the ancient core, a dense maze of fortified streets, underground casements, naval gun positions, and the monstrous Fort Montbarey looming like a dark sentinel over the city. The Germans had lost territory, but not their will. They fell back into the inner defenses, sealing doors, resetting firing positions, preparing for the next struggle. And the Americans realized with a sinking weight in their chests that the capture of the outer forts was not an end. It was only the beginning.
The fall of the outer forts should have felt like a turning point, a moment of victory. But as the Americans advanced into the ruined outskirts of Brest on the fourth brutal day of the siege, they discovered that the real battle had only just begun, because the city itself, its streets shredded, its buildings gutted by bombardment, its narrow alleys clogged with rubble, had become an extension of the fortress, a labyrinth of death that forced every man who entered it into a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare where the enemy could be hiding behind any collapsed wall or lurking beneath any floor. From the moment the first platoons of the 2nd and 29th Infantry Divisions stepped beyond the last cleared bunker and into the shattered remains of the residential districts, they came under immediate and precise fire from snipers positioned in the upper floors of half-destroyed houses, their rifles poking through slit-like openings in walls that the bombardment had carved into jagged silhouettes. Mortars began to fall in irregular but deliberate patterns, walking explosions across streets that funneled the Americans into predictable kill zones. Machine guns fired from windows that still stood, and from holes in walls that no longer resembled part of a structure. The city was not simply destroyed, it was engineered through destruction, turned into a deadly maze where every pile of bricks, every overturned trolley car, every cratered street had been mapped, studied, and turned into a shooting gallery by German engineers and paratroopers who now fought with the fatalistic zeal of men who had been ordered to die in place rather than surrender. As the Americans pushed deeper, they found that progress could not be measured in blocks or buildings, it could only be measured in meters. Each intersection became a miniature battlefield. Each ruined building had to be stormed, cleared, checked for tunnels, then checked again after the Germans rallied and attempted to retake it through unseen subterranean passages. Often the defenders simply vanished when the Americans approached, retreating through holes smashed in cellar walls, reappearing on the flank minutes later to unleash sudden bursts of fire that sowed confusion and forced entire units to pivot. Engineers led the way, moving slowly through rubble-strewn streets with mine detectors sweeping the ground ahead in cautious arcs. The Germans had mined everything: doorways, stairwells, abandoned vehicles, even corpses rigged with grenades meant to detonate when moved for burial.
The booby traps slowed the American advance to a crawl. A single street could take an hour to secure, sometimes more, and all the while, German defenders watched from the shadows and prepared their next ambush. One particularly savage fight erupted around the remnants of a brick warehouse near the Penfeld River. The structure, its roof partially collapsed and its interior choked with debris, appeared deserted from a distance. But as an American squad approached, a sniper shot cracked from an upper window, dropping the point man instantly. The squad scattered, taking cover behind rubble, returning fire toward the window. But the sniper had already moved. Moments later, a burst of MG-42 fire tore across the courtyard from a different angle entirely, pinning the entire platoon behind a collapsed wall. Engineers tried to flank the building, only to be met with grenades hurled from a hole in the roof. When a finally Sherman tank arrived to suppress the defenders, it fired a high explosive round into the warehouse facade, blowing out an entire section of wall. Dust, bricks, and splinters filled the air. Under the cover of the explosion, American assault teams sprinted into the building, only to find themselves engaged in brutal room-to-room combat as German paratroopers, some covered in dust, others bleeding but still fighting with desperate tenacity, fired at point-blank range from behind improvised barricades made of doors, furniture, and sandbags dragged in from neighboring houses. It took nearly 2 hours to clear that single warehouse. When it was finally secure, the Americans found a concealed tunnel entrance in the basement leading toward the interior of the city, another reminder that every victory was temporary unless the tunnels were sealed. Elsewhere, the Germans used the ruins to devastating effect. In one neighborhood, they had demolished entire rows of houses themselves, not from bombardment, but intentionally, to create fire lanes for machine guns positioned hundreds of meters away. These clearings allowed German gunners on far-off hills to fire down long, empty corridors of rubble, hitting any American who dared to cross. Tanks attempting to support infantry were vulnerable as well. The narrow, uneven streets restricted movement, and hidden anti-tank teams waited in collapsed storefronts, stepping out only long enough to fire Panzerfaust rounds before disappearing back into the rubble. One Sherman tank turned a corner and was immediately struck by 2 anti-tank rounds in rapid succession, the detonations blasting the turret hatch shut with molten shrapnel. Infantry rushed forward to rescue the crew, only to encounter grenades rolling down from a second-floor balcony. The explosion killed 2 soldiers instantly. The survivors pulled back, regrouped, and called for smoke to obscure the street before attempting another advance. This was how Brest fought. Every inch contested, every movement dangerous. In the center of the ruins, the Americans encountered what they would later describe as German pockets of insanity, clusters of defenders who fought with unbelievable ferocity, refusing to surrender even when encircled and outnumbered. One such group occupied a block of 4 buildings arranged around a courtyard. When the Americans stormed the outer houses, they found the defenders had barricaded stairwells with furniture and barbed wire, turning every floor into a separate fortress. The courtyard was rigged with mines. Snipers on the upper floors covered the approaches. For an entire afternoon, that courtyard became a killing ground, with smoke drifting through broken windows and the staccato rhythm of rifles echoing through the ruins like a grim heartbeat. The defenders held on until every last man was either dead or unconscious. As the day wore on, American units began to adapt. They stopped assuming buildings were empty. They stopped advancing along predictable streets. Instead, they moved through walls, literally. Engineers used explosives to blow holes from one building to the next, allowing infantry to advance internally without exposing themselves to sniper fire. Flamethrowers were brought forward more frequently, clearing basements and tunnels with terrifying efficiency. Mortar teams took up positions on rooftops, lobbing shells into suspected German nests. Tanks fired point-blank into buildings, collapsing entire floors onto the defenders below. Slowly, painfully, the Americans pressed deeper into the ruined districts, pushing the Germans back toward the inner fortress line. But the Germans adapted as well. As outer buildings fell, defenders retreated into hardened positions deeper inside the city, structures reinforced with concrete, steel, and sandbags, connected to one another by a spider web of tunnels that crisscrossed beneath the streets. When one strong point fell, another opened fire. When a block was cleared, a counterattack erupted from a previously silent corner. German paratroopers, many of them veterans of Crete and Italy, fought with the precision and calmness of trained killers. Kriegsmarine sailors, unfamiliar with urban combat but determined to obey their orders, manned machine guns and anti-aircraft guns repurposed for ground defense, firing until the barrels glowed red. Even Hitler Youth members fought with chilling zeal, darting through rubble-strewn alleys with grenades clutched in shaking hands. By late afternoon, the Americans had pushed nearly half a kilometer into the ruined outskirts, but the cost had been severe. Casualties mounted as medics sprinted through rubble fields under fire, dragging wounded men into makeshift aid stations set up inside ruined churches and collapsed schools. Stretchers piled up. Water supplies began to run low. Ammunition runners were forced to cross open ground under relentless sniper fire, carrying heavy crates of bullets and grenades on their backs. Communications were sporadic. Radios struggled to operate in the narrow streets, and runners often disappeared into the chaos, never reaching their destinations. And yet, despite the carnage, progress was undeniable. The Americans were carving their way into the fortress. The lines on their maps, once representing impossible obstacles, now edged deeper into the city. Commanders, though grim-faced and weary, saw a path forward. It would be slow, ugly, and bloody, but it existed. As evening approached, the Germans launched one final counterattack. A force of paratroopers surged out of a tunnel entrance near a destroyed tram station, firing wildly at American rear positions. For a moment, chaos rippled through the lines as units spun around to face this unexpected assault. But American officers responded instantly, calling for artillery to fire danger-close barrages. Shells slammed into the far end of the ruined street, collapsing the tunnel entrance and trapping or killing the counterattacking force. When the smoke cleared, the paratroopers lay scattered across the rubble. Night fell over a city that looked less like a place where people had once lived and more like the remains of a planet destroyed by catastrophe. Fires burned in blocks where flamethrowers had cleared German nests. Smoke drifted through windless streets. Occasional sniper shots cracked in the distance. But the Americans held their positions. They had advanced, they had survived, and they knew that tomorrow they would push deeper into the heart of the beast. For if the ruins were this brutal, the inner fortress, Montbarey, the Citadel, the naval batteries, would be far worse.
The push toward Fort Montbarey began before sunrise on the 6th day of the siege, as American commanders realized that no matter how many blocks they cleared, no matter how many bunkers or machine gun nests they blasted apart, the key to breaking the German defense of Brest lay in capturing this giant granite leviathan that brooded over the western approach like an immovable monument to the art of siege warfare itself. Even from a distance, Montbarey looked like something torn straight from a medieval war epic, a squat, massive citadel with walls so thick that even direct hits from 155mm howitzers merely chipped its stone skin. The Germans, aware that this was the Americans' next target, had transformed the interior into a fortress of the 20th century, reinforcing ancient walls with reinforced concrete, filling casements with machine guns and anti-tank guns, burying ammunition in deep magazines, and creating interlocking kill zones designed so precisely that any attacking infantry would be exposed to at least 3 fields of fire from the moment they stepped into range. As dawn light seeped into the smoky air, American reconnaissance patrols crawled forward across the shattered ground, attempting to identify gun positions, mine belts, and tunnel entrances. They found some, but not all.
and when American artillery began the preparatory bombardment, Montbarey proved its reputation immediately. It did not break. It did not crumble. It simply swallowed the explosions and waited. The bombardment lasted an hour. Hundreds of shells slammed into the fort, blasting away earth banks, shredding barbed wire, and tearing at the outer walls. Smoke rose in thick plumes that drifted across the battlefield like storm clouds. But when the shelling stopped and silence settled briefly over the landscape, the defenders of Montbarey answered with a roar. Machine guns fired from the casements as if they had been untouched by the bombardment. Mortars launched from within the moat. Rifles cracked from narrow embrasures, each shot deliberate and deadly. And then came the dreaded sound, the deep, thunderous boom of the 88mm guns concealed within the fort's inner walls. Their first rounds struck an American tank approaching along the narrow approach road, blowing it apart in a violent eruption that threw debris high into the air. The second round slammed into a Sherman's turret, welding the hatch shut with molten metal and immobilizing the tank. The defenders had been waiting for this moment, and they greeted the approaching Americans with fury. The infantry assault began under a curtain of smoke laid down by mortar teams. Soldiers of the 29th Infantry Division advanced in bounding movements, taking cover behind craters, overturned vehicles, and chunks of fallen masonry as bullets cracked past their helmets. Engineers followed closely behind, pushing carts loaded with explosives, Bangalore torpedoes, and flamethrowers. The first objective was the moat, a wide, water-filled obstacle that surrounded Montbarey and funneled attackers into exposed channels. Crossing it required both courage and precision. Engineers crawled forward to clear mines while under constant fire. Snipers in the fort attempted to pick them off, but American marksmen positioned in ruined buildings provided covering fire, playing a deadly duel of patience and accuracy that left both sides with casualties. When the first infantry squads reached the moat, they threw grappling hooks attached to ropes, hoping to scale the slippery embankment. Most of the hooks fell short or slid off the wet stone walls. A few caught. Clusters of soldiers scrambled up the incline, only to be met with grenades dropped from above. Explosions sent men tumbling back into the water. Others managed to reach the parapet and engage the defenders in savage, point-blank firefights. A flamethrower team attempted to support them, sending arcs of burning fuel over the wall, but a German machine gun burst struck the fuel tank, turning the operator into a fireball. His assistant dragged him back, screaming for medics, while the rest of the team pushed forward to continue the assault. The Americans tried another approach, blasting through the walls. Engineers placed satchel charges at the base of the outer fortification, retreating behind tank halls as the explosives detonated with thunderous force. Chunks of stone flew in every direction. For a moment it seemed as though the wall had cracked. But when the dust settled, the breach was smaller than expected, barely large enough for one man to crawl through. Still, it was something. A squad rushed the opening, slipping into a partially collapsed corridor within the wall. The Germans, anticipating such attempts, had placed machine guns deeper inside the structure, creating interlocking fields of fire within the fort's interior. The moment the Americans entered, they were hit from multiple angles. 3 men fell immediately. The survivors retreated, realizing that the interior of Montbarey was a nightmare of choke points, kill tunnels, and hidden firing chambers. American tanks attempted to suppress the fort's guns, but Montbarey's defenders had prepared anti-tank traps. The narrow approaches were mined so heavily that tank crews were terrified to advance without engineers walking ahead with mine detectors, a task that invited disaster. Several vehicles hit mines, exploding in showers of fire and metal. Others became stuck in craters created by earlier bombardments. Even when tanks managed to get within firing range, the fort's thick walls absorbed most of the impact. High explosive shells shattered on the granite. Armor-piercing rounds punched through, but did little internal damage. The 88s kept firing, knocking out tank after tank. By midday, the assault had stalled. American commanders called for reinforcements, flamethrower teams, demolition units, and tank destroyers. They also called for something unusual: naval artillery.
Offshore, Allied ships had been targeting German positions along the coast, but now they were asked to deliver pinpoint fire on Montbarey itself. The ships obliged. Shells with naval-grade explosive charges crashed into the fort. Walls shook, dust poured from embrasures. Some positions went silent. For the first time, the defenders of Montbarey looked rattled. Sensing a possible breakthrough, American infantry surged forward again. Under covering fire, engineers sprinted toward the moat with Bangalore torpedoes and detonated more breaches in the barbed wire. Flamethrower teams finally managed to reach the base of the walls and sent continuous streams of burning fuel into firing slits, forcing the Germans back. Machine gun nests went silent as flames poured into the casements. Riflemen and BAR gunners climbed the cratered slopes and reached the parapet. A fierce close-quarters battle erupted along the outer wall. Grenades exploded in rapid succession. Soldiers grappled in the smoke and dust. One American threw himself over a grenade to shield his squad. German paratroopers counterattacked from a side passage, firing MP-40s at point-blank range. For a moment, it seemed the Americans might be pushed back again, but they held. More infantry pressed up, more flamethrowers roared. Engineers placed charges against the massive inner doors. When the charges went off, the blast echoed like thunder within the fort's hollow space. The wooden and steel gates buckled, flames shot through the opening. The Americans surged into the outer courtyard of Montbarey. What awaited them inside was even worse. The courtyard was a maze of trenches, barricades, and interconnected bunkers. Machine guns fired from hidden slits. Grenadiers popped up from below ground, hurled explosives, and vanished again. Mortars launched from subterranean chambers. The interior layout was so complex that units became separated within minutes. The battle devolved into dozens of micro-engagements, fierce, short, and deadly, playing out simultaneously in the labyrinth of stone. When American tanks attempted to enter the courtyard to provide support, they found that the floor had been mined and rigged with explosives. One Sherman rolled over a pressure-activated charge and exploded violently, sending flaming debris in all directions. Infantry used the burning wreck as cover, advancing deeper into the stronghold. Slowly, with flamethrowers clearing bunkers and engineers sealing tunnel entrances, the Americans carved their way through Montbarey's interior. German resistance remained fierce until the very end. Many defenders refused to surrender, fighting until they were burned out, blasted apart, or shot in their positions. Some retreated deeper into the fort's underground levels, only to be trapped when engineers detonated charges that collapsed the passages. By dusk, after hours of relentless fighting, the last pockets of resistance inside Montbarey finally fell silent. The Americans secured the stronghold. Bodies lay everywhere. Americans, Germans, sailors, paratroopers, engineers. The smell of smoke and burned fuel clung to every surface. The interior of the fort was a charred, blasted ruin. As darkness settled over the battlefield, the men who had survived sat in exhausted silence, staring at the blackened stone of the fort they had taken at such enormous cost. Montbarey was theirs. But beyond it lay the city center, the naval district, the Citadel, and the last fanatical defenders who had sworn to fight until no man remained. The road to victory had opened, but the worst fighting still lay ahead.
The fall of Fort Montbarey sent a tremor through the German lines, but it did not break them. If anything, it pushed the defenders deeper into the inner city, with a renewed fanaticism born from desperation, and understanding that their sanctuary, their masterpiece of defensive engineering, had finally succumbed to American fire and fury. As dawn broke on the 7th day of the siege, the Americans advanced from the smoldering ruins of Montbarey into a city that no longer resembled a place where civilians had once lived. The closer they drew to the heart of Brest, the more the ruins took on a kind of surreal, apocalyptic character. Buildings had been reduced to skeletons of stone and twisted metal. Streets were blocked with overturned vehicles, shattered masonry, and craters so deep that tanks could not cross them without risk of toppling in like trapped insects. Fires burned unchecked in collapsed warehouses. Smoke drifted endlessly through the air. Every step forward, forced the soldiers of the 2nd, 8th, and 29th Infantry Divisions into a nightmare maze that seemed designed to devour them. The Germans, now compressed into a shrinking defensive pocket around the Citadel and the Naval District, fought with a level of ferocity that stunned even battle-hardened American veterans. They had lost the outer forts. They had lost Montbarey. But the last phase of the battle, street fighting in the ancient city core, was where they were most prepared to bleed the Americans dry. German paratroopers, Kriegsmarine sailors, fortress troops, and even a handful of fanatical Volkssturm irregulars moved seamlessly through the rubble, knowing every alley, every tunnel, every vantage point. They rigged entire rows of collapsed homes with explosive charges that they detonated as American squads passed. They created false barricades to funnel attackers into ambush zones. They positioned snipers in the highest surviving points, cracked bell towers, broken bridge supports, anything offering even a few meters of height, and used these perches to rain down precise, deadly fire on American infantry. The fight for each street became a brutal contest of endurance and will. American platoons advancing toward the Citadel were forced to clear every building, every cellar, and every attic. In many cases, they discovered that German units had already withdrawn through underground tunnels, appearing behind them minutes later to launch sudden counterattacks. These tunnels, some medieval, some modernized by the Germans, others hastily dug, were the secret circulatory system of Brest's remaining defenders. American engineers sealed entrances as soon as they found them, but the labyrinth below the city was so vast that closing one passage merely redirected German movement to another. The sense of constant vulnerability weighed on every soldier. Even ground they believed secure could erupt into gunfire without warning. One of the fiercest engagements occurred around a shattered rail depot near the Penfeld River. The Americans entered the courtyard cautiously, expecting sniper fire from the tall skeletal structure that dominated the scene. Instead, they were hit by a coordinated ambush that erupted from 3 different angles at once. Paratroopers, hidden beneath collapsed train cars, fired MP-40 bursts at close range. Machine gunners positioned in a half-destroyed office building opened fire from sandbagged windows, and in a brutal surprise, a naval gun repurposed for anti-personnel use fired from beneath a railway arch, its high-velocity rounds ripping through stone walls and the bodies of the men taking cover behind them. The Americans responded instantly, calling for smoke, mortars, and tank support. A Sherman rolled into the depot, firing high-explosive shells into the office building, collapsing its facade. Infantry squads advanced under the shell fire, clearing the remaining defenders with grenades in close-quarters combat. The fight lasted less than 20 minutes, but when it ended, the ground was soaked with blood, and the depot was a shattered ruin within an already shattered city. Elsewhere in the city, German defenders used the ruins themselves as weapons. A platoon of American infantry approaching a row of collapsed buildings found themselves pinned under fire from a sniper in a windowless third-story corner that seemed inaccessible. Engineers used explosives to breach the lower wall and send an assault team inside. But when the men reached the upper floors, they found no German sniper, only a rope dangling from a hole in the ceiling where the marksman had escaped moments earlier. The sniper was found 2 blocks away, firing from a new position, before disappearing into another tunnel. This pattern repeated throughout the day. The Americans gained ground, only for the defenders to reappear elsewhere, always forcing the attackers to fight the same blocks multiple times. The siege also revealed the extraordinary creativity of the German defense. In one section, the defenders had reinforced a rubble pile with steel beams, turning it into an artificial hill from which they positioned machine guns. The Americans, assuming the heap was unstable debris, were caught off guard when an entire platoon was pinned down by fire from above. Tanks tried to suppress the machine guns, but the guns were positioned deep within the rubble behind angled armor plates scavenged from wrecked vehicles. Only flamethrowers and point-blank explosives were able to clear the position, and even then, the Germans counterattacked through a tunnel entrance behind the rubble mound, forcing the Americans to fight for the same ground twice before finally securing it. As the city compressed, so did the brutality of the fighting. Streets barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side became battlegrounds where entire squads fought running gun battles. Grenades exploded so frequently that the sounds blended into a continuous rolling thunder. When flamethrowers were used, defenders sometimes chose to charge the flames rather than be burned alive, resulting in close-quarters clashes that left both sides dead in tangled heaps. The psychological strain was immense. Soldiers moved with jittery, twitching caution, knowing that any doorway might conceal a booby trap, any seemingly dead body might be rigged with explosives, any faint sound in a cellar might be a German squad preparing to emerge behind them. Medics worked tirelessly, dragging wounded men into shattered buildings and shielding them from falling debris as artillery continued to pound the city around them. The wounded screamed for water, morphine, help, sometimes drowned out by the next explosion before their voices faded. Meanwhile, German commanders inside the Citadel issued increasingly desperate orders. Ammunition was running low. Food was nearly gone. Water was limited. Medical supplies were non-existent, but surrender was forbidden. Ramcke, the German general in command, held firm that Brest must resist to the bitter end. His men obeyed with a grim, fatalistic devotion. Paratroopers who had once jumped from planes now fought from bunkers like cornered wolves. Kriegsmarine sailors, whose ships had long since been destroyed or scuttled, fought with the anger of men who knew they would never see the sea again. Even teenage Hitler Youth fighters, many no older than 16, threw themselves into the battle with horrifying zeal, often charging American positions with grenades in both hands. The Americans, though shocked by their determination, were equally determined to survive, to push forward, and to end the siege. By midday of the 8th day of the siege, American forces had captured nearly half of the city center, but the cost had been tremendous. Hundreds of soldiers were dead or wounded. Tanks were burning in the streets, their blackened husks turned into landmarks for units to navigate by. Mortar craters overlapped one another like pockmarks on the face of the earth. Still, the Americans pressed on. They had to. The Citadel loomed ahead, the last and most heavily defended position in Brest. Its massive walls and underground galleries cast a long shadow over the ruins below, a reminder that the final stage of the siege would make everything so far look like a prelude. As night fell, German defenders launched a final counterattack in the most devastated quarter of the city, emerging from tunnels and cellars with a fury that surprised even the weary Americans. The fighting continued long into the darkness, illuminated only by tracer fire, burning buildings, and flares dropped from overhead. In the end, the counterattack was repelled, but the message was clear. The defenders would not break easily. They would not surrender without inflicting every possible wound on the attackers. As the smoke finally settled and the guns fell silent for the night, the Americans dug in among the rubble, exhausted, filthy, half-deaf from the constant roar of battle, but alive. The Germans, fewer in number now but still deadly, retreated into the inner defenses, tightening the ring around the Citadel and naval base. The city streets had collapsed. Brest was dying, but its defenders were not finished. The siege was entering its bloodiest phase.
The assault on the naval district began under a sky thick with smoke, the kind of choking gray haze that seemed to press the entire ruined city of Brest beneath its weight. By the 9th day of the siege, the Americans had forced the German defenders into an ever-shrinking pocket that centered around the ancient citadel and the sprawling naval complex that surrounded it, an intricate, hardened sprawl of dry docks, submarine pens, underground magazines, reinforced artillery positions, and fortified coastal batteries that had once served as one of the most important Kriegsmarine bases on the Atlantic. Even now, with the port useless, the submarines gone and the war collapsing around them, The German sailors and coastal artillery crews who remained in the district clung to their posts with the fanatical determination of men who had been told that surrender was treason and that death in battle was the only honorable end. They knew the Americans were coming. They knew the outer city had fallen. They had heard Montbarey go silent. Yet they prepared, methodically and without hesitation, to fight inside what was arguably the most fortified section of the entire city, a place built from concrete, steel, and stone to survive bombardment from naval shells, aerial bombs, and anything short of the apocalypse. As the Americans approached, they immediately understood that the naval district was a different battlefield altogether. The first hint came from the sudden, deafening roar of a coastal battery, one of the last functional guns in Brest, firing down a rubble-choked street at extreme close range. The shell screamed past a platoon of advancing infantry and obliterated a building behind them, reducing it to a plume of dust and flame. The blast wave knocked men off their feet. Before they could recover, the battery fired again, and a geyser of shattered masonry erupted only meters from the American line. The crews of these coastal guns, 88s, 105s, and even a few 150mm monsters that had once fired at Allied ships, were now using them as direct fire weapons against approaching infantry and tanks. Their booming reports echoed through the ruins with terrifying force, drowning out even the stutter of machine guns. With their hardened positions carved deep into reinforced concrete galleries, these gunners were nearly immune to American artillery. The bombardments that had flattened blocks of the city barely scratched them. The Americans responded with tanks, Shermans, and tank destroyers, attempting to maneuver through the maze of narrow streets and collapsed buildings to find angles on the coastal batteries. But the naval district had been deliberately engineered to repel such advances. The roads were narrow, winding, and now clogged with rubble. Engineers were forced to clear paths under fire, using explosives to remove obstacles while German snipers picked at them from the shadows. Every time a tank came into view, a coastal battery fired, forcing the crew to reverse at high speed or risk being reduced to molten metal. One Sherman tank managed to fire a shell into an embrasure of a battery, only to receive a retaliatory shot that penetrated its thin side armor and sent flames billowing from its hatches. The surviving crew crawled out, coughing and screaming, before being dragged to safety by infantrymen who braved machine gun fire from a bunker that had suddenly come alive on their flank. The naval bunkers were the heart of the resistance, vast underground chambers connected by tunnels so thickly reinforced that even direct hits from aerial bombs had only scorched the entrances. Each bunker was a mini fortress, steel doors, firing slits, internal firing chambers, and racks of ammunition stretching deep into the earth. The defenders, mostly Kriegsmarine sailors in tattered uniforms, fought with a strange duality, some with the rigid discipline of naval professionals, others with the savage energy of men who had lost everything and were now fighting only for a violent, uncompromising end. When the Americans approached a bunker, its defenders unleashed machine gun fire so intense it carved streams of sparks from the stone walls. Engineers tried to flank the positions, but the bunkers had interlocking fields of fire that made approach from any direction dangerous. One bunker, designated Seahorse by American troops, anchored an entire intersection with its overlapping machine gun chambers. Repeated American attempts to storm it were repulsed with heavy casualties. Even flamethrowers had difficulty reaching its firing slits due to the angles of the walls and the narrowness of the street. Finally, a tank destroyer was brought forward, firing a series of point-blank high explosive rounds into the bunker's facade. The concrete splintered under the barrage, but the structure held. Only after engineers crawled forward under smoke and placed a massive satchel charge beside the main entrance did the bunker finally crack open in a violent explosion that ripped away half of its outer wall. American infantry poured into the smoking ruin, clearing the interior chamber by chamber. The defenders inside fought to the last man. And that was only one bunker. The naval district was riddled with them. As the Americans pressed deeper, they encountered the massive submarine pens, titanic structures of reinforced concrete designed to protect U-boats from Allied bombs. The entrances had been collapsed by previous strikes, but the interior still housed German sailors who used the vast hallways as defensive choke points. Machine gun nests were hidden behind steel doors. Grenadiers dropped explosives from catwalks high overhead. Snipers fired from cracks in the walls, their shots echoing ominously through the cavernous spaces. The Americans advanced slowly, methodically, throwing grenades into every dark corridor and clearing rooms that felt more like industrial catacombs than part of a city. The smoke from burning fuel inside the pens mixed with dust and the sharp chemical smell of explosives, creating an air so foul it made men gag. Outside, along the waterfront, the fighting was equally savage. German coastal artillery crews refused to abandon their guns. When shells ran low, they fired whatever remained: illumination rounds, armor-piercing rounds, even star shells directly at American positions. Some sailors mounted machine guns on top of their own destroyed artillery pieces, turning them into improvised strongpoints. American infantry advanced along the docks, exposed to fire from multiple angles. The maze of cranes, overturned rail cars, and shattered shipping containers created unpredictable lines of sight. Snipers fired from behind rusted hulls. Mortar teams hid behind collapsed warehouses. The defenders, squeezed tighter and tighter into the waterfront, grew increasingly unhinged in their resistance. Several groups launched nighttime counterattacks, emerging from tunnels beneath the docks in surprise assaults that lasted only minutes but left dozens dead. Throughout the naval district, the Americans faced a new challenge: booby-trapped magazines. The Germans had wired underground ammunition stores with explosives, intending to detonate them once the Americans entered. Engineers had to clear these deadly traps under the threat of both snipers and sudden tunnel attacks. Several times, explosions ripped through the area as Germans triggered charges prematurely, or as stray rounds struck unstable stacks of shells inside the bunkers. The ground shook, dust rained from overhead. The Americans learned quickly to approach every underground room with absolute fear. The German defenders were clearly dying, but they refused to show it. Even as ammunition dwindled, they made every shot count. Even as the Americans breached bunkers, the defenders counterattacked through alternate tunnels. Even as bodies piled up in the corridors of the submarine pens, new defenders emerged from hidden galleries to take their place. The Kriegsmarine fought with an intensity fueled by hopelessness. They knew they were surrounded. They knew their base was gone, but their orders were absolute and they clung to them with desperate zeal. The Americans adapted as well. Flamethrowers became indispensable. Engineers were deployed at the front of every squad. Tank destroyers provided direct fire support on hardened targets. Mortar teams lobbed shells into tunnel entrances. Riflemen cleared narrow passages with grenades and bayonets. It was slow, grinding, exhausting work, every meter contested, every bunker requiring its own miniature siege. By late afternoon, after hours of relentless effort, the Americans finally broke through the last ring of bunkers guarding the naval guns. The final battery, a monstrous coastal cannon with massive reinforced chambers, fell only after a multi-pronged assault involving direct tank fire, flamethrowers, and satchel charges placed by engineers who crawled across a killing field of rubble to reach the entrance. When the last explosion echoed across the ruins, the cannon fell silent forever. With the naval district collapsing, the surviving Germans withdrew into the innermost fortress, the ancient Citadel of Brest, where they prepared to make their final stand. The Americans, exhausted but victorious, looked toward the looming stone stronghold. The end was near, but the Citadel would make them pay for every step.
The approach to the Citadel of Brest began before sunrise on the 10th day of the siege, and it felt less like advancing toward a military objective and more like walking toward the mouth of a living, breathing creature carved out of stone and centuries of violence.
Even battered by artillery, scorched by naval bombardments, and surrounded by a city reduced to rubble, the Citadel remained an awe-inspiring and deeply intimidating sight. Its walls rose like cliffs, colossal slabs of ancient granite fused with modern German concrete reinforcements that gave it the appearance of something both medieval and industrial, a hybrid fortress designed to repel invaders from any era. The moat surrounding it was deep, wide, and still partially flooded despite the weeks of bombing. Every visible entrance was barricaded with thick steel plates, welded crudely but effectively across gates and archways. Machine gun ports dotted the walls like narrow, watchful eyes. And somewhere deep within its labyrinthine interior, General Ramcke and the final remnants of his garrison, the most fanatical paratroopers, Kriegsmarine survivors, fortress infantry, engineers, and even a handful of Hitler Youth, prepared to make their last stand. The Citadel was the heart of Brest, and it would not fall quietly. The Americans understood immediately that this would be the hardest phase of the siege. The outer city had been hell. The naval district had been a furnace. But the Citadel, that was something else entirely. Something ancient and immovable. Something built to withstand storms, cannon, and invasion. The U.S. 2nd and 29th Infantry Divisions, already exhausted from nearly 2 weeks of continuous combat, advanced toward the stronghold with a mixture of grim resolve and simmering dread. Engineers crawled ahead, probing the ground for mines. Tanks lumbered forward behind them, their guns elevated toward embrasures. Mortar teams positioned themselves in the ruins for immediate support. And overhead, artillery spotters prepared to call in danger-close fire on the outer ramparts. But as soon as the first American soldiers entered range of the Citadel walls, the fortress erupted to life with a roar that seemed to shake the foundations of the earth itself. Machine guns opened first, at least a dozen of them, firing from narrow slits cut into the stone. Their overlapping fields of fire transformed the open ground before the moat into a killing zone where no one could stand upright without drawing a storm of bullets. American infantry dove for cover in shell craters, behind collapsed masonry, and inside the remains of half-demolished buildings. Mortars followed, whistling down from deep within the fortress. German gunners had pre-sighted every approach. Shells landed with terrifying precision, exploding with concussive force that rattled the teeth of anyone nearby. Snipers fired from hidden vantage points on the battlements, picking off officers, NCOs, and radio operators whenever they exposed themselves for even a moment. Every movement was observed, every mistake punished. The Citadel might have been old, but its defenders fought with modern ruthlessness. The Americans responded in kind. Artillery was brought to bear in a thunderous bombardment that shook the sky. Dozens of howitzers opened fire simultaneously, their shells crashing into the ramparts with explosions so powerful they sent geysers of stone and dust rising dozens of meters into the air. For an hour the bombardment continued. Fire, smoke, shrapnel, thunder. It seemed impossible that anything inside the fortress could survive. But when the smoke lifted and the barrage ceased, the machine guns opened fire again as if nothing had happened. Many embrasures were still intact. Some had collapsed only partially, allowing the defenders to continue firing through the debris with adjusted angles. The Citadel had shrugged off the storm. The assault began anyway. American infantry surged toward the moat under a rolling wave of suppressive fire. Engineers carried Bangalore torpedoes to clear barbed wire and mines. Flamethrower teams advanced behind tanks, using the vehicles as mobile cover. The first squads reached the moat's edge, only to discover that the Germans had widened the killing zones by demolishing the outer wall, forcing attackers into narrow choke points where machine guns fired from 3 angles simultaneously. Several soldiers fell instantly. Grenades rolled down from above. Mortar rounds bracketed the moat, trapping units in place. A tank destroyer attempted to cross a cleared section of the moat using a collapsed bridge as a makeshift ramp, but the Germans had anticipated the maneuver. The moment the vehicle reached the halfway point, an 88mm shell fired from deep inside the citadel struck it squarely, detonating the ammunition inside and turning the tank into a flaming inferno. The explosion threw burning fragments across the charred grass. The surviving crew stumbled out, their uniforms aflame, and were dragged to safety by medics under heavy fire. The Americans realized that even approaching the citadel was nearly suicidal. But the engineers pressed on. Under covering fire, they deployed Bangalores to blast clear the barbed wire. The explosions ripped apart tangled metal, clearing narrow passages through which infantry squads crawled toward the base of the wall. Flamethrower teams surged forward, sending jets of burning fuel into the embrasures. Screams echoed from within the fortress as the flames forced gunners back from their positions. Tanks fired point-blank at the parapets, their high-explosive shells detonating against stone with bone-shaking impact, cracking the ancient structure and sending chunks of rock tumbling into the moat. A breach team reached a sally port, a small, reinforced entryway the Germans had sealed with iron plates. Engineers planted a massive satchel charge against it, withdrew behind a tank hull, and detonated the explosives. The resulting blast shook the entire wall section, blowing the iron door inward and creating a jagged opening filled with dust and smoke. American infantry surged inside. What greeted them was not a quiet interior, but a labyrinth of death. The first room was a long, vaulted chamber lined with firing slits and murder holes in the ceiling. German defenders used these overhead apertures to drop grenades and fire pistols downward at the intruders. The Americans, caught in a choke point, suffered immediate casualties. They responded with grenades of their own which bounced unpredictably across the uneven stone floor before exploding in deafening blasts. When the smoke cleared, the Americans pushed deeper into a corridor that split into multiple directions. Each passage was a killing funnel. Each doorway hid a machine gun nest. Each flight of stairs was rigged with explosives. The battle for the interior of the citadel became a brutal, claustrophobic nightmare. In some corridors, the fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat. In others, flamethrowers were the only effective weapon, filling chambers with fire that forced defenders to retreat or die. Grenades detonated so frequently that the interior echoed like a thunderstorm trapped underground. Paratroopers ambushed American squads from behind false walls. Kriegsmarine gunners fired anti-tank rifles down stone hallways, their rounds punching straight through multiple soldiers before burying themselves in the granite behind them. Snipers used the murder holes above stairwells to fire downward at attackers who couldn't return fire effectively. Every movement was observed, every mistake punished. The citadel might have been old, but its defenders fought with modern ruthlessness. The Americans responded in kind. Artillery was brought to bear in a thunderous bombardment that shook the sky. Dozens of howitzers opened fire simultaneously, their shells crashing into the ramparts with explosions so powerful they sent geysers of stone and dust rising dozens of meters into the air. For an hour the bombardment continued. Fire, smoke, shrapnel, thunder, it seemed impossible that anything inside the fortress could survive. But when the smoke lifted and the barrage ceased, the machine guns opened fire again as if nothing had happened. Many embrasures were still intact. Some had collapsed only partially, allowing the defenders to continue firing through the debris with adjusted angles. The citadel had shrugged off the storm. The assault began anyway. American infantry surged toward the moat under a rolling wave of suppressive fire. Engineers carried Bangalore torpedoes to clear barbed wire and mines. Flamethrower teams advanced behind tanks, using the vehicles as mobile cover. The first squads reached the moat's edge, only to discover that the Germans had widened the killing zones by demolishing the outer wall, forcing attackers into narrow choke points where machine guns fired from 3 angles simultaneously. Several soldiers fell instantly. Grenades rolled down from above. Mortar rounds bracketed the moat, trapping units in place. A tank destroyer attempted to cross a cleared section of the moat using a collapsed bridge as a makeshift ramp, but the Germans had anticipated the maneuver. The moment the vehicle reached the halfway point, an 88mm shell fired from deep inside the citadel struck it squarely, detonating the ammunition inside and turning the tank into a flaming inferno. The explosion threw burning fragments across the charred grass. The surviving crew stumbled out, their uniforms aflame, and were dragged to safety by medics under heavy fire. The Americans realized that even approaching the citadel was nearly suicidal. But the engineers pressed on. Under covering fire, they deployed Bangalores to blast clear the barbed wire. The explosions ripped apart tangled metal, clearing narrow passages through which infantry squads crawled toward the base of the wall. Flamethrower teams surged forward, sending jets of burning
fuel into the embrasures. Screams echoed from within the fortress as the flames forced gunners back from their positions. Tanks fired point-blank at the parapets, their high-explosive shells detonating against stone with bone-shaking impact, cracking the ancient structure and sending chunks of rock tumbling into the moat. A breach team reached a sally port, a small reinforced entryway the Germans had sealed with iron plates. Engineers planted a massive satchel charge against it, withdrew behind a tank hull, and detonated the explosives. The resulting blast shook the entire wall section, blowing the iron door inward and creating a jagged opening filled with dust and smoke. American infantry surged inside. What greeted them was not a quiet interior, but a labyrinth of death. The first room was a long, vaulted chamber, lined with firing slits and murder holes in the ceiling. German defenders used these overhead apertures to drop grenades and fire pistols downward at the intruders. The Americans, caught in a choke point, suffered immediate casualties. The survivors responded with grenades of their own, which bounced unpredictably across the uneven stone floor before exploding in deafening blasts. When the smoke cleared, the Americans pushed deeper into a corridor that split into multiple directions. Each passage was a killing funnel. Each doorway hid a machine gun nest. Each flight of stairs was rigged with explosives. The battle for the interior of the citadel became a brutal, claustrophobic nightmare. In some corridors, the fighting devolved into hand-to-hand combat. In others, flamethrowers were the only effective weapon, filling chambers with fire that forced defenders to retreat or die. Grenades detonated so frequently that the interior echoed like a thunderstorm trapped underground. Paratroopers ambushed American squads from behind false walls. Kriegsmarine gunners fired anti-tank rifles down stone hallways, their rounds punching straight through multiple soldiers before burying themselves in the granite behind them. Snipers used the murder holes above stairwells to fire downward at attackers who couldn't return fire effectively. The Americans fought back with equal fury. Engineers collapsed tunnels with explosives. Riflemen fired at shadows, hitting defenders as they emerged from side passages. BAR gunners laid down suppressive fire at point-blank range. At one point, an American squad discovered a hidden gallery that allowed the Germans to maneuver silently between floors. Engineers detonated charges to collapse the entire ceiling, sealing the passage and killing the defenders inside. Meanwhile, on the battlements, another ferocious battle raged. American troops who had scaled the outer walls under covering fire found themselves on narrow walkways, exposed to German fire from higher towers. Snipers picked them off from arrow slits. Machine guns fired up through gaps in the stone. Grenades dropped from above. Yet the Americans pressed on, storming parapets, tossing grenades into embrasures, firing rifles from precarious positions on the crumbling walls. By noon, the Americans had secured multiple footholds inside the citadel, but the fortress refused to break. German defenders retreated deeper into the stronghold, sealing steel doors and barricading hallways with overturned furniture, sandbags, and rubble. They established new fire positions and launched sudden counterattacks designed to push the Americans back out of the entry chambers.
One counterattack by German paratroopers nearly succeeded in retaking the breach, only to be stopped by a flamethrower team that swept the corridor with fire, forcing the attackers to retreat or die. Throughout the afternoon, the Americans continued to grind their way forward, inch by inch, chamber by chamber, tunnel by tunnel. Every meter was paid for in blood. Outside, American artillery continued to pound the upper walls. Inside, grenades and flamethrowers did the work. The Citadel was dying. Its defenders were dying with it, but none of them surrendered. Not yet. As evening fell, the Americans had finally reached the inner courtyard, the heart of the Citadel. They could see shattered barracks, collapsed towers, and the last desperate pockets of resistance firing from behind makeshift barricades. But the Germans still held the command bunker, and Ramcke was still alive. The end was coming, but the Citadel would make the Americans fight for every last stone before it fell.
The final hours of the Siege of Brest unfolded under a sky thick with dust and smoke, a grim, swirling haze that seemed almost to mourn the city's impending death. Inside the Citadel, its ancient walls fractured, its courtyards burning, its corridors filled with the tangled bodies of Americans and Germans alike. The last surviving defenders clung desperately to their final positions, reduced now to a few dozen chambers carved deep inside the fortress core where General Bernhard Ramcke had established his command post. The air trembled continuously from explosions as American engineers detonated charges to collapse tunnels and breach new entry points. The great stone citadel, which had withstood centuries of storms and invasions, now groaned like a living thing being torn apart from within. Fires burned in shattered barracks, machine gun nests sputtered weakly from upper galleries until they were silenced by point-blank flamethrower blasts. The smell of cordite, burning fuel, and charred stone saturated every breath. Yet Ramcke refused to yield. Even as ammunition dwindled and casualties mounted, even as communications broke down and entire battalions ceased to exist, he barked orders with iron fury, insisting that the fortress must continue fighting, that they were warriors of Germany, paragons of duty, and that surrender to the Americans would not only stain their honor, but betray the Führer's explicit command: fight to the last man. What remained of the German garrison had been compressed into a shrinking maze of underground galleries and reinforced compartments. Some defenders, paratroopers, hardened and scarred from earlier campaigns, still clung to their rifles with stoic determination, eyes burning with defiant resolve. Others, Kriegsmarine gunners now stripped of their guns, reduced to fighting with pistols and grenades, moved through the tunnels like ghosts, bleeding, limping, coughing from smoke inhalation, yet unwilling to abandon their posts. A few teenage Hitler Youth survivors huddled together in terror, their earlier fanaticism now reduced to trembling desperation as they listened to the American steady advance. The fortress felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode, its defenders fighting not for strategic value, Brest was lost, but because surrender was forbidden and because Ramcke's authority remained absolute. There were no retreat routes left, no hope of relief, no place to run, only the stone walls and the enemy waiting to breach them. The Americans, advancing deeper into the labyrinth, felt the tension in their bones. Nobody moved quickly. Every doorway could be rigged. Every corner could conceal a desperate defender ready to fire at point-blank range. Engineers led each push, probing with bayonets for tripwires, placing charges on steel doors, and signaling infantry forward only after ensuring the path would not erupt beneath their feet. Flamethrower operators, now indispensable, moved like grim executioners, clearing entire chambers with bursts of fire that illuminated the corridors with sudden, hellish light. Tanks, unable to enter the deeper passages, remained outside the citadel, their crews watching anxiously as the infantry disappeared into the suffocating darkness below. Above ground, medics dragged wounded men from trench lines and shattered stairways, their faces gray with exhaustion and horror.
The Americans had fought through hedgerows, through towns, through bunkers, through the naval district, but this final assault was something new, something ancient and monstrous, a war inside a stone womb. The breakthrough toward Ramcke's headquarters began with the capture of a reinforced junction chamber, a place where 4 tunnels intersected, each blocked by German barricades and defended by machine gun nests firing down narrow chutes carved into the stone. For hours, American riflemen tried to push in, only to be beaten back by grenades that bounced off the walls like ricocheting hornets. At one point, a German machine gunner fired continuously until his barrel glowed red, then grabbed a fresh belt and continued firing even as Americans brought up a flamethrower that finally silenced him in a burst of scorching heat. The junction chamber fell, but only after a fight so savage that the walls ran slick with blood. The moment the Americans secured it, engineers rushed forward with satchel charges to destroy 3 of the 4 tunnels leading deeper. A series of explosions shook the Citadel, collapsing entire sections of the underground gallery and sealing dozens of defenders behind walls of rubble. The 4th tunnel remained open, leading directly toward the core of the fortress where Ramcke's command staff waited. The Americans moved cautiously into the tunnel, rifles raised, helmets pulled low, eyes scanning every inch of the oppressive stone corridor. The deeper they descended, the hotter and more suffocating the air became. Fires in upper levels had heated the stone. Smoke seeped from cracks in the ceiling. The tunnel sloped downward into near darkness, illuminated only by flickering flashlights and the occasional spark from a ricocheting bullet. Somewhere ahead, the Germans waited. A single shot echoed through the tunnel. Then, silence. The Americans froze, listening. No echoes of movement, no shifting gravel, just that eerie stillness that comes when an enemy is waiting for you to step into the kill zone. The kill zone arrived 2 minutes later. As the Americans rounded a tight corner, a hidden machine gun opened fire from a recessed chamber cut into the wall. The bullets tore through the lead ranks, dropping 2 soldiers instantly and forcing the rest to dive backward against the jagged stone. A second gun opened fire from a cross aperture, then a third. The tunnel became a vortex of noise and sparks as bullets screamed down its length. The Americans were pinned, unable to move forward. Grenades tossed down the corridor bounced off the ceiling and rolled back toward the attackers. One soldier threw himself on a grenade to shield his squad. His sacrifice allowed engineer teams to rush forward using a makeshift blast shield. With bullets pinging off the metal, the engineers crawled close enough to place a demolition charge against the machine gun chamber's firing slit. The explosion shook the tunnel, collapsing part of the chamber and killing the defenders inside. American infantry surged forward, clearing the remaining positions with controlled bursts. The tunnel widened into a larger subterranean hall that had once been a supply depot. Defenders defended it from behind crates, overturned tables, and sandbag positions. The firefight was intense, echoing like thunder in the enclosed space. Flamethrowers cleared half the room in seconds. The survivors retreated deeper. Then came the final door. It was massive, reinforced with steel, riveted into stone thick enough to withstand a tank round. German engineers had welded additional plates onto it in the final days, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. Behind it they could hear movement, shifting boots, whispered commands, the metallic clatter of a machine gun being prepared. Ramcke and the last 40 or 50 defenders were inside. American officers called for surrender. No response. They called again, louder, demanding that Ramcke open the door and release his men. A single shot was answered, fired through a crack in the door, grazing an American sergeant's helmet. There would be no surrender. The engineers set their largest remaining charge and ordered everyone back. The blast that followed was so violent that it shook loose dust from every surface in the citadel above. The steel door buckled, twisted, and finally collapsed inward with a tortured scream of tearing metal. The Americans surged through the smoke-filled opening and straight into Ramcke's last stand. The interior chamber was a nightmare. Ramcke's staff had overturned tables and ammunition crates to form makeshift barricades. Machine guns fired from sandbagged corners. Grenadiers hurled explosives down the room. A paratrooper leapt up with a Panzerfaust, firing blindly at the Americans. The rocket streaked past and exploded against the stone wall, sending debris flying. The Americans returned fire, sweeping the room with rifles and bars, dropping defenders one by one. A flamethrower burst turned the far-left barricade into a wall of burning fuel. Screams filled the room, cut short by gunfire. The defenders fought with a wild, hopeless fury, men who knew their time was up and refused to die quietly. At the far end of the chamber, Ramcke himself stood behind a heavy wooden table that served as his improvised command desk. His paratrooper cap was tilted back, his uniform scarcely recognizable beneath layers of dust, blood, and soot. He fired a pistol until it clicked empty. Then he reached for another. The Americans pressed forward, bullets shattering the stone behind him. A grenade landed near his feet, but one of his staff officers kicked it back before it detonated harmlessly against the far wall. Another officer was blown off his feet moments later by a flamethrower burst aimed high over the barricade. Finally, as American infantry closed within a few meters, Ramcke threw down his pistol, not in surrender, but because it was empty. He glared at the advancing soldiers, chest heaving, his face twisted with rage and exhaustion. For a moment it looked like he might charge them with his bare hands. Instead, he raised his arms slowly, defiantly, and screamed at the top of his lungs, "I have obeyed my orders. I have done my duty." Then he collapsed onto the debris, not dead, but utterly defeated.
With Ramcke's capture, the last German resistance began to crumble. The remaining defenders, those still alive in scattered corners of the Citadel, finally laid down their weapons. The Americans secured the chamber, carried out the wounded, and extinguished the last burning barricades. Outside, the white flags began to rise across the ruins of Brest. The Siege of Brest was over, but its cost in blood, in time, in agony, had carved itself into every soldier who survived it. The morning after the Citadel fell, a strange, heavy quiet settled over Brest, a silence so profound that it unnerved the soldiers who had spent nearly 2 weeks living inside the continuous roar of warfare. For the first time since the siege began, no artillery shells whistled overhead, no machine guns rattled from hidden nests, no mortars thumped from unseen corners. The smoke still drifted through the ruins, rising from fires in collapsed buildings and shattered bunkers. But even those flames seemed subdued now, burning without urgency, as if the city itself had finally exhausted every ounce of fury it possessed. The Americans moved cautiously through the streets at first, rifles raised, expecting snipers or traps. But the defenders were finished. Their guns were silent, their tunnels empty, their command staff either dead, wounded, or captured. The white flags, which had begun to appear in scattered pockets the previous evening, now spread across the city like pale blossoms against the blackened rubble. Torn bed sheets, pieces of shirts, scraps of canvas tied to shattered beams or bent flagpoles. The defenders who remained emerged slowly from the ruins, German infantrymen with blank, hollow faces, teenage Hitler youth trembling with fear, paratroopers bleeding from untreated wounds, Kriegsmarine sailors who looked more like coal miners than naval personnel, covered in soot from the burning submarine pens. Many staggered out with their hands raised, others limped forward on makeshift crutches. A few had to be dug out from collapsed tunnels and hauled into the daylight by American engineers. Even then, some still attempted to salute before collapsing, as if clinging desperately to the last threads of military formality. One of the most surreal scenes of the aftermath occurred outside the main gate of the Citadel, where hundreds of Germans gathered in a disorganized line, waiting to be processed as prisoners of war.
Some held onto their rifles until American soldiers gently took them away. Others clutched their few remaining personal belongings, letters from home, dog tags of fallen comrades, pieces of food salvaged from ration stores. A German officer, barely able to stand, insisted on presenting his sword formally to an American captain, who accepted it with the same solemnity. Another officer broke down in tears, not from fear, but from the crushing realization that the fortress he had sworn to defend, perhaps the strongest fortress on the entire Atlantic Wall, had finally fallen despite his best efforts. In the distance, the fortress walls loomed like gravestones, their cracked faces staring silently down at the men, victors and vanquished alike, who now moved beneath them. The Americans, though exhausted, carried themselves with a weary professionalism. They had fought street by street, bunker by bunker, tunnel by tunnel. They had watched friends die in alleys, in courtyards, inside burning warehouses, and under the shadow of Montbarey. They had watched tanks erupt in flames, had listened to medics scream for more bandages as the wounded piled up, had prayed in moments of stillness when German counterattacks threatened to overwhelm them. And now, finally, it was over. Some soldiers sat on rubble piles, staring in disbelief at the quiet city. Others cleaned their weapons mechanically, unable to break the habits of constant readiness. A few walked among the ruins in stunned silence, observing the devastation with awe and horror. Buildings that had once housed families were now mangled husks of brick. Streets that had once been bustling with life were now craters and debris fields. Entire neighborhoods had been erased, not damaged, erased. It was as if a giant hand had clawed through the city, ripping away its history and leaving a landscape of ash. Engineers moved quickly to clear mines and booby traps that still littered the ruins. They worked carefully, knowing that the Germans had left surprises behind in their retreat. Tripwires connected to grenades hidden under stones, concealed charges buried beneath collapsed walls, ammunition stores wired to blow at the slightest disturbance. More than once, an explosion echoed through the city as an unseen trap detonated without warning. American medics sprinted toward the blasts out of instinct, only to discover that the victims were often curious soldiers or German prisoners who had wandered too close to a dangerous corner. The city was no longer a battlefield, but it was far from safe. Meanwhile, American officers met with the surviving German command staff to negotiate the formal surrender of the remaining pockets in the city. General Ramcke, captured, defiant, still attempting to project authority from his stretcher, was brought into a makeshift headquarters inside a damaged school building. Even in defeat, he attempted to argue that his men had fought with honor and should be granted special concessions. The Americans listened politely but remained unmoved. Ramcke requested that he be allowed to keep his paratrooper beret during internment. The Americans allowed it, understanding that even the most fanatical enemy deserved dignity in surrender. Other German officers, stripped of their weapons and their commands, sat in stunned silence as the terms were read aloud. Some nodded mechanically, others looked at the floor, a few openly wept. Outside, the sheer scale of the destruction became painfully visible. The naval district, once a proud symbol of German maritime power, now resembled a scrapyard of twisted steel, shattered cranes, and smoldering bunkers. Entire sections of the submarine pens had collapsed inward, forming tombs for defenders who had refused to flee. Fires were still burning in the fuel stores, sending thick black plumes upward. The docks were littered with debris, scorched timbers, pieces of hull plating, broken rail cars, and the mangled remains of coastal guns that had once threatened Allied ships. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and death. The civilian population of Brest, what little remained of it, began to emerge from basements, cellars, and improvised shelters where they had hidden throughout the siege. Many had lost everything: homes, possessions, family members. They wandered through the ruins in a daze, searching for familiar landmarks in a city that no longer existed. Some approached American soldiers with tears in their eyes, thanking them for liberation even as they mourned the destruction. Others simply sat among the rubble, silently taking in the devastation. American medics provided what aid they could, distributing food, water, and medical supplies. Engineers helped pull civilians from collapsed buildings. Chaplains offered comfort to those who had lost loved ones. The strategic victory at Brest carried enormous significance. The fortress had tied up tens of thousands of American troops for weeks, time that could have been spent advancing deeper into France. The port itself, one surprised prize for the Allies, was now so thoroughly destroyed that it would take months to rebuild even the most basic facilities. The Germans, in their fanatical defense, had ensured that Brest would never serve as a major Allied support port during the war. In that sense, Ramcke's orders had achieved their goal, but the cost had been staggering. The Germans lost nearly all of their 40,000-man garrison, killed, wounded, or captured. The Americans suffered thousands of casualties, and the city of Brest was sacrificed to the fires of war. As the sun set over the ruins, casting long shadows across the cratered earth, American soldiers gathered on the outskirts of the Citadel to reflect on what they had survived. Some spoke quietly among themselves, sharing stories of narrow escapes and fallen comrades. Others sat alone, staring into the flames of burning debris, replaying the horrors of the siege in their minds. A few laughed, not out of joy, but out of the strange relief that comes when the constant threat of death is finally lifted. They joked about the stubbornness of the German defenders, the insanity of the tunnel system, the terrifying moments inside the Citadel. But beneath the laughter was exhaustion and grief. The next morning, burial details fanned out across the ruins to collect the dead, German and American alike. The bodies lay everywhere, in trenches, in collapsed bunkers, in alleyways, inside the Citadel's corridors, in courtyards still stained with soot and blood. The work took days. Soldiers carried the remains with solemn respect, knowing that each body represented a life cut short by a war that demanded everything. Grave markers sprouted like weeds across makeshift cemeteries. Chaplains read prayers in multiple languages. The wind carried those words across the silent city. In the end, Brest taught everyone, American, German, civilian, the same brutal lesson. A fortress, no matter how strong, no matter how fierce its defenders, is ultimately a tomb if held too long. The Germans had fought with unmatched determination, but the cost had been total. The Americans had taken the city, but at a price that left no victor untouched by sorrow. The siege ended, but the memory of Brest's ruin lingered in the hearts of all who survived it. A fortress had fallen, a city had died, and the world moved on, leaving behind only silence and stone.